right, everyone. So welcome back to Veterans for Cannabis. I'm Jared Campbell, and joined with me as always is my big brother, Big C, Carlos.
Yo.
Brother, over the last 3 episodes, we've been laying the foundation for this entire discussion. In part 1, we introduced the Supreme Court's decision and why it's become one of the most significant cannabis-related Second Amendment cases in recent history. Then, of course, we dwelled into part 2. We examined the ATF Form 4473 and why millions of responsible cannabis users have found themselves caught between the state law and also the federal law. Last week, we also looked into Ali Hemani himself. We talked about who he was, talked about what happened and why he was charged, and why this case eventually reached the Supreme Court. But today, I think we get to what is probably the most important part of this entire series we've been doing. Can the federal government permanently deprive someone of Second Amendment rights solely because the person regularly uses marijuana? And that was what was brought before the Supreme Court. Because before we can understand the court's answer, we have to understand the actual question the court was asked. And that was the question that was asked. And here's where I think a lot of people, including the media, sometimes gets it wrong. Carlos, what do you think the Supreme Court was actually deciding?
So this is what I have to say when it comes to, and it could be that I'm biased too, but I think this was one of the most common sense cases and questions ever questioned, right? We have noticed, case after case after case, re-examining every other drug, crack cocaine, for example, in the early 2000s, yet, people with a small amount of cannabis on their packet were getting stiffer sentences, non-offense, non-violence, right? So the question here, right, is can the government automatically disarm or prosecute them as a felon based solely on regular marijuana use? Question mark, right? That's the question. And one thing, everybody knows what was the answer, right? The answer is no, right? But what everybody, including me, asked is where were the perimeters of it? Am I going too far? So the perimeters, right? The left and right limits. That was a question that I had. What is the right, left, and right limits, right? Because we have to be common sense, right? So here is what the limit of the rulings, okay, which is, so we're going a little bit past, but understanding the ruling of the ruling of the rules, the limit of the rules will help understand the whole case, right? And I think this is the first time anybody has made common sense of this. So it says the Supreme Court explicitly defined this narrow ruling. Legal parameters left untouched or open interpretations include active impairment, okay? Meaning, the government may still regular or prosecute individuals who are actively intoxicated under the influence while carrying or operating a firearm, right? It's always been like this with alcohol. If you are drunk, you better not be near a firearm. Common sense, right? Okay, other controlled substances. Okay, the ruling does not extend a blanket protection to users of other illicit substances, for example, cocaine, meth, or opiates, which carry an entirely different risk profile. We have known this forever, okay? Individualized dangerousness. The federal statute remains, it can still prosecute, okay, individuals prove that specific person drug use rendered them dangerous, okay? Other gun bans. The ruling does not cast doubt on other firearm restrictions, such bans of convicted felons, individuals legally adjudicated with severe mental defect. So it's very common sense. Okay, it is very common sense. Okay, if you're under the influence, you shouldn't be behind a wheel, and you sure shouldn't be behind a freaking gun. Okay, and that includes anything: alcohol, weed, freaking shrooms, whatever. Right? Control substance. Everybody and their mama knows. Okay, cocaine will make you do fucked up shit. Excuse my language. Beep that for me. Okay, meth and opiates. I never been on that. Okay, so I don't know. But I can tell you, cocaine will make you party. Okay, so saying that, I'm just gonna leave it there, right? So I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I think we live in a world where it needs to like make it make sense because, I can just take a walk, right? And I can probably in my walk find at least 3 or 4 liquor stores and only walk past probably one cannabis shop. Okay. So I know from experience what alcohol did to me. All right.
Mhm.
Alcohol and me should never have been around a firearm, much like even a vehicle or even having keys or anything to operate anything. But like you said, any substance, I mean, you shouldn't be operating anything, no matter whether it's alcohol, whether it's weed, whether it's cocaine, whether, you're taking maybe prescription medicine. There's some prescription medicines that it tells you not to operate machinery as well as
Mhm.
drive. So, yes, it goes back to common sense. But we live in a society where I have seen where alcohol has caused more, I would say, more problems and more violence than I've ever seen anybody using marijuana has ever done. But that's
Mhm.
based on experience, right?
Yeah.
So,
But I
alcohol
mean,
is
also,
so much more
excuse me for this.
easily for us to get. But go ahead.
And I was like, excuse me for this, but it's not only experience, but also data, you know? I mean,
Right.
what's the leading cause of death among adults today, other than fentanyl? Drunk driving, I believe.
Drunk driving is pretty high up there.
You know,
Even
eh,
even that with distracted driving is another thing.
yeah,
But that's a whole different that's a whole different discussion. But
yeah. But anyways, like without being thing. But to me, those are common sense questions. Okay, and the question goes back again, and the constitutional question. Okay, can the government automatically disarm a citizen or prosecute them as a felon based solely on regular cannabis use? The answer is no. Can I just treating it just like alcohol? And I'm like so happy about. I'm not gonna sit here, nor I'm not gonna pretend that I'm a saint, but I'm not either going to, I'm pleading the fifth, and I'm talking generally speaking here, right? If you were, I'm not saying I'm a saint, but if you were to drunk drive or smoke a doobie and drive, right, and you get pulled over, don't be coming to me with sorry mean shit. If you are, people can drive, they intoxicated, but some people can drive better than others. I'm just going to leave it there, right? Despite how good you can drive, you get pulled over and they blow you and you have a DUI, you have a DUI. Plain and simple. Okay, own it. That's just my thoughts. Sorry.
it goes back to common sense. Right? At the same time, like you always say, do what your wallet can afford, right? But be careful with that. but
Yeah, that's what I tell my kids. That's what I tell my kids.
but I don't think anybody should be driving around smoking marijuana no more than they should be driving around and drinking alcohol. It's the same. Nobody should be doing any of those things.
Yeah.
But
That is common sense. Like again, some people live in the woods and they like doing their own thing. Look, right. If something goes wrong, own it. Like you can shoot guns all day long in the woods. But if something goes wrong and you under the influence, own it. You're like, yeah, I was intoxicated. Plain and simple. But anyways,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
here was something I was thinking, right? The more I kind of read about this case, do you think it had to do less about cannabis and more to do with firearms? Think about gun control from that point of view. I mean, it's like a hypothetical, right? I
Yeah.
mean, the Supreme Court ruled the way it ruled, but it's
What would it be more about, guns or cannabis? Okay. So they call this the court's reasoning, or they testing the legal ideas. It's a test, right? And they put
right.
several past opinions. They put them in the cannabis. So it has to do more with cannabis in this one. Okay, cannabis, and they comparing it to alcohol. Okay, so the first test was the flawed historical analogy. Okay, the Trump administration attempted to defend the ban of comparing 1800 habitual drunkenness law. The Supreme Court flatly reject this, noting that historical drunk work laws only target individuals who were sweeping status-based bans on anyone consuming a substance. So, in other words, that you have to be drunk. Okay, so when they look at this law, they already said, for you to be banned of owning or be punished for owning a weapon, you have to be drunk. That's the first test. They already ruled that. Okay. The second rule, the lack of due process. Okay. The court emphasized that most modern bars and federal bans operate that a person is actually dangerous. Okay. Data have shown that drunk individuals are more dangerous than cannabis individuals. That's clear. right? I cannot pronounce this, but multiple justice noticed cannabis has become widely normalized and is legal in some form across more than 40 states and further referred the federal government on ongoing effort to reclassify marijuana to a less restrictive here. Okay, so three rules: drunkenness, but yeah, the drunkenness rules, right? Lack of due process, and the fact that we have country after country benefiting from cannabis use, right? So the rule was very narrow. It was very convinced that if other countries can do it, okay, we can do it as well. Okay, and other than that, the when comparing both alcohol and marijuana, marijuana seemed to be less dangerous, right? So when they compared the drunkard law, okay, from the 18th century, they go, okay, so that was stupid. So how we need to look at this further. And ultimately, did that make sense?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay,
No, 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 no.
so
I'm tracking.
so it had to be, they looked at weed, cannabis in a Second Amendment spectrum. So Second Amendment was the blanket, and they were looking how cannabis will fit in there. And they noticed that alcohol was already placed there, as you have to be actively drunk and dangerous to yourself. And it's been practiced in countries over and over again. That's so it was the test. So do we have any questions? Do you got any thought?
No, but I have like a question, maybe if somebody's listening, maybe for
Okay.
audience or something, is that how, if you're pulled over and they suspect you of smoking weed, how are you tested? Kind of like, do they do the same thing they do with drunks? Is it the same type of test? I don't know. It's just a question. I don't think I've ever researched that or
So
anything.
So yeah, they actually it's similar to alcohol. They actually have a testing protocol, But remember this, solely because you have cannabis in your vehicle, it doesn't make you driving under the influence. That's huge. Okay,
Right.
and that was ruled in another, I think it was Florida Supreme Court. Okay, so in other words, you can have X amounts of pounds in your vehicle and they cannot prosecute you for driving under the influence. And I hope I was reading that correctly, but I'm like 99% sure that's what Florida said. So yeah, there is a procedure to test you. I don't know if it's like a blow or a blood test. It could be a blood test, a little
Hmm.
poke. They test you. The problem with that is that will last up to 45 days and it's not quite accurate.
Right.
Okay.
Well, THC stays in the body for a while because it clings to like fatty cells and stuff.
Yeah.
So
So
you can you can
like
you
a,
can you can
like a
have THC in your system for a long time. So
yeah, for a one-time user, it will be about 45 days.
yeah, yeah.
So give or take. It could be less if you drink a lot of water and you're speeding. If you are fat, it could be up to 2 months. And I used to be a drug person in the army, so I know all this crazy stuff. So,
Yeah, I was
but
I was I was prior service, and I tried to go back in, and I popped hot for THC because I was smoking weed, and so it took me about 2 or 3 months to actually for it to clear.
yeah,
I do remember
yeah,
that. I drink like a
yeah.
shitload of water.
Yeah, oh yeah, that's the
But
best way to, yeah. But anyways, man, I think
yeah,
we actually beat the horse on this subject. I mean, I think there's a clear distinction of common sense in comparison when it comes to cannabis in compared to our years. So
I
I
think I
think
think it's
that
been a heck of a discussion.
yeah, so I think if we have any lawyers listening, put your 2 cents. Tell me how I messed up the interpretation or how close I was. Just give. But based on what I read and understand, that's what it said. So any thoughts before we head out? Is right where we want to be.
I think it was a great discussion. I learned a lot from it. I would tell everyone to enjoy your Friday, enjoy the weekend. Yeah, peace,
And
and just
remember, do what.
just
And
sit back, smoke a little, enjoy life.
yeah,
That's all I can say.
and I said, remember, do
Yeah.
what your wallet can afford.
Yeah.
So
All
be
right.
safe, everybody. Have a good one. All right, later.
All right, brother. All right.
All right,
Bye.
peace.